What's up, everyone, and welcome to the Long Game Podcast hosted by Thomas Kopelman and Jacob Turner. In each episode, you'll hear us break down financial topics that are relevant to you and your situation. Our goal is to help bring credible financial information to you in short, bite-sized episodes.
All opinions expressed on this show are for educational, informational, and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on the Long Game Podcast should be considered advice. Always consult with your team of professionals before making any decisions regarding your finances.
All right, what is up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Long Game Podcast. You're here with me, Thomas Kopelman, Jacob Turner, and then our most repeated guest, Ben Lake. Ben's a great advisor. He's an advisor I partner with on a lot of, ultra high net worth, complex, financial cases, which is why we really brought him in today. And so today's topic, we're not even going to spend time talking about Ben's, his credentials and everything. He's a smart dude. You can go back to all the other episodes that are really good he's been on and you can learn about it. But today what we're going to talk about is defined benefit plans. And I think this is a really important topic for this like higher net worth, higher income crowd. And, Ben is a perfect person to talk about this. So Ben, let's just kind of start off with what even is a defined benefit plan?
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm honored to be the most repeated guest here in the podcast because that's just fantastic news to hear. I'm also probably going to have to add to my card that I'm a certified smart dude. That's a new like tagline for my business cards. I love that. What is a defined benefit plan? So defined benefit plans live within the world of qualified or retirement accounts or retirement plans. So it is just one of many options in the world of like, if you want to save for retirement, especially if you're a business owner, here's a great tax advantaged tool to pull from the tool shed to use for that purpose. It is one of the older kinds of retirement accounts and also one of the more complex kind of retirement accounts. And so we're going to get into the strategy around it. I don't think we need to get too technical with it because we will be here for the next 7 years just talking about the technicals. I'm pretty sure podcasts should not be that long. Fair to assume, but that's the short story. It's a retirement account. The slightly longer story is that it has some really good tax advantages, and so it's very attractive. But it really only works best in certain situations. It is not made for everybody, right? That's kind of why they've created other things. I'm sure we'll get into like the difference between this and 401ks and IRAs and the other things that are out there. But within the retirement landscape, it's one of my favorite tools to at least try to use where it makes the most sense.
So yeah. Ben, for this kind of plan, let's start with who do you think it is best for? You mentioned that there's obviously complexities that go into that. We're going to go into more of the details of it. But if you were just talking in generalities about the person that you're looking at, you're saying, hey, this might make sense for you in your situation. What does that individual look like?
So great question. That person is a business owner of some kind with high income. Those are the first two qualifications. Simple as that. To make it a little bit more complicated, but not really, it's really a person with high income in a business who also like really does want to save for retirement, not just for the tax benefits, which are obviously very significant with any kind of retirement plan, but for someone who really wants to put away, a decent amount of money for that kind of goal. And so when we start to kind of peel back the onion, it makes more and more sense for folks who are typically a little bit older, right? Most people who bring this up, most advisors who bring this up with their clients are really only talking to people who are like 50 and above in terms of age. I mostly bring it up people who are between, kind of 24 and 40. And Thomas and Jake, both you guys are kind of in that same boat. Like we've got a lot of clients in that age spectrum. We'll get into the details why, but when you're looking at it from a person's perspective who's a little bit younger, there's a few more things to be aware of, but keeping it simple. Like if you're making a lot of money, you're trying to, simultaneously, save for the long term, the medium term, and the short term, and save on taxes. If you're a business owner and you have high income, you should be talking about this with an advisor.
Yeah. And I think there's like a few even more steps further than that. It's high income, high surplus, I think is really important, right? If you make $1.5 million, but you're spending 1.2 million, this might not necessarily be the best place to do it. Because again, there's still some downsides, and I think we'll go through it. But for the average business owner, right, when they use this, it doesn't come before a solo 401k or a regular 401k based on the business. That is really the starting point. And 401ks or solo 401ks are still cheaper. They're a little bit easier to set up, and they still allow you to get quite a bit of dollars in. And so where we end up seeing this make sense is for people who are doing that and still have a significant amount of money, right? So with their solo 401k, I mean, they're putting in the 23,000 plus probably all the way to 69,000, deferring all of that before they even start to think about the cash balance plan. And for me, I like to see them doing that, back to a Roth, adding to a taxable account, or having a pretty big taxable account already, and then starting to think about the cash balance plan.
I think it's a really good point, because you're absolutely right. Like there's layers to how to plan for retirement in general, especially as a business owner. And Thomas, you just mentioned a few of the other accounts that are probably like lower hanging fruit, and in some cases, definitely a higher priority, right? Just using a solo 401k, or if you have employees, a regular 401k, maybe a SEP IRA. Like those are the two more common tools to use. Defined benefit plans would be on top of that, not instead of. And that's a pretty important distinction, right? You usually don't want one or the other. You want one or both. And the key with the defined benefit plan is that there's more rules around it. And basically what that means is there's less flexibility from one year to the next, which is kind of why, like to Thomas's point, like you really do want to have high income that you have pretty high confidence can be repeated no matter what age you are. So but that's especially true for younger folks. And so let me kind of give you some of the reasons why. Basically, it's because defined benefit plans are truly about a defined benefit, right? They are the most common ones that everyone has probably heard of to some degree is a pension. And there's all kinds of pensions out there, but usually the pension is designed to say, when you retire at this age, say 65, here is the monthly income you will receive from this plan. And that monthly income is the defined benefit, right? 401k plans, SEP IRAs, regular IRAs, they are not defined benefit. They are defined contribution. You know how much you're going to put in, but you're not sure what it's going to be in the future. And therefore you can't define the benefit. You just know what you put in. So those are the two different parts of this world. And so because you're trying to meet some kind of defined benefit, the way to calculate that is very actuarial in nature, which is just a fancy way for saying you need fancy math to be involved. And so because you're trying to hit a defined benefit, whatever you're putting in each year gets analyzed from one year to the next to say, okay, if you're this many years away from retirement, which is where the age factor comes in, then if we assume a certain rate of return, also a very important variable, then here's how much you need to put in to get that benefit. And so because you're trying to hit one target as a benefit in the long term, you don't have quite as much control over the contributions because the contributions are calculated for you. You get to kind of figure out, how much confidence you have that you can meet that or not. And if you don't have that confidence, it may not be a great fit. If you want to put in a ton of money and it's actually more than you need for a defined benefit plan, then maybe, kind of dial your expectations back a little bit and approach it basically as objectively as humanly possible. So I'm giving you kind of a little bit of the ins and outs here, but the idea is that it operates in a bit of a different fashion than what people usually hear about. And pension plans, the most common one out there is Social Security. Everyone probably to some degree has seen a Social Security, statement or concept of, all right, when you turn 62, you're going to get this much, 65, this much, 70, this much. That's pretty straightforward. Thomas mentioned cash balance plans a second ago. They are defined benefit plans, but they work differently. As opposed to seeing a statement that says you're going to get X amount per month in income, which is a normal pension plan, cash balance plans show you how much money you actually have and how much money you could have, by the time you do retire. And so that's actually a somewhat newer version of defined benefit. I actually like it better. I think it's actually a bit more advantageous for a couple of reasons. But the short story, without getting into the technicals, is basically that you do get a little bit more flexibility around the contributions you can make and how long you want to make them for. If you don't know if you're going to, sell your business in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but you want to have one of these plans, a cash balance plan might give you a bit more of a comfort level around how many years you want to kind of commit to or try to commit to contributing for. So again, I'm trying to kind of bring it to a point without getting too technical, but the strategy essentially is if you've already got very high income and you want to put some away for retirement, then you want to put a bit more away into these kinds of plans, some version of a defined benefit plan for you, and maybe a cash balance plan for you, or if there's partners or employees, you can really stack things up. And maybe it's worth kind of going over an example or two, but I'm sure you guys all have clients in this general spectrum who could use this. One of the ones I was just talking to is quite young. She's literally 30. And the difference between how much you can put into a 401k at any age isn't terribly wide, right? This year it's $69,000 is kind of the most you can put into a 401k. It changes every year. But that number is relatively flat across ages. She's going to use a cash balance plan, and she's going to basically put in probably another roughly 60,000 or so. So nothing humongous, but the total between the two is 129,000 going into pre-tax accounts. If she was 55, that 60,000 could probably be closer to about $200,000. So that's why you usually see it used at people who are older levels, basically because they're trying to hit a certain benefit with much less time between their current age and their actual, expected retirement age. She's got 25 plus years, 35 plus years to do that. So it's lower contributions for now, but she can invest it in a way that still creates a lot more long-term, a lot more short-term tax benefits, a lot more long-term assets. And then we can get into things like, do we convert some portion of her retirement assets or all of them to Roth if she were to, retire early? So that's another kind of layer to the strategy as well.
So let's talk about each variable here one by one. So I think first variable is, cash balance plans, the main one we're going to be talking about is probably the main one that we see used. So first variable is age, right? So based on your age gives you how much that you can contribute. So 30 to 34 this year is like 79,000, 35 to 39 is 101, 40 to 44 is 130, all the way to 66 to 70, you can do $376,000. So step one is age. Step two is figuring out time of the plan, right? 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. So let's have you talk about some of the options there, what to think about with that. And then I think the one that we want to go into after that is kind of that hurdle rate, because that's a really big component of cash balance plans.
Yeah, I think so. A few things on those various variables, like you said. The first and foremost is really, is it worth it in the first place? Because when you're talking about ages and those significant changes in how much you can contribute, this may or may not make sense if you can only contribute and get just enough of a tax break to offset the costs. Because the other part of any of these plans is they do cost something to set up and cost something to maintain, right? 401ks, SEP IRAs these days, incredibly easy and cheap to establish. Defined benefit plans require more paperwork. They require an actuary to sign off on kind of the numbers you're using. And they generally require a tax form, 5,500, typically speaking. So it's probably a couple thousand to a few $1,000s a year to have these things. Mm-hmm. But like you said, age is probably the most important variable. But that other one you just mentioned, so like when you're talking about age, it's not just in a vacuum, it's also how long you're going to keep this plan going. One of the biggest risks with any defined benefit plan is if you start it 1 year and then eliminate it the next, the IRS is going to basically look at that and say, we don't think you were really in this to create a defined benefit plan. We think you were in this for a quick, tax dodge, and we are going to disallow the whole plan. And any contribution you made previously, we're now going to undo that and assume that you have to go pay taxes on it. And that could be a lot. If someone tries to do a massive defined benefit plan 1 year and all of a sudden has to take it all out the next, not only have you wasted the fees, but you've also, kind of wasted a ton of tax dollars. So that's a huge issue. Now it can be a little subjective when it comes to talking about this variable, because if you're 30 and you say, all right, I'm going to do this for the next 10, 15 years, and you start your business and it's going really well and you're making maybe 7 figures a year, maybe half that, because this can make sense at lower income levels, of course. But if you wind up selling the business, let's say in year 4 or 5, well, then what? Right? Is the IRS going to be mad at you? Short answer is probably not, but it's still something to at least think about, because selling a business is one thing. Deciding to retire at age 33 is a very different thing.
So do you then tend to lean towards shorter time frames, or what's the benefit of doing longer time frames, if any?
I mean, the benefit of doing it over a longer time frame is, generally speaking, being able to put more contributions in each year. So, for example, if this gets talked about a lot in service industries, right? Lawyers, architects, doctors, anything like that, if they own private practices, even advisors, CPAs. If you're going to plan to stick with that career and you have the income and the cash flow to justify it, you can put money away for a very long time. And the nice part about that is a lot of tax breaks while you're in these high tax years. And then if at some point over the long term, you decide to either retire earlier or not, you can kind of figure out if additional strategies make sense. Things like Roth conversions, maybe QCDs if you want to be very charitable. So that's the benefit of doing things over a longer time frame. The other benefit, of course, is that you're much less subject to potential scrutiny from the IRS. If you were to try to fund things in a very short period of time, if you wanted to say, okay, well, maybe I'm 30, 35, 40, and I want to put as much away as possible now, can I kind of overfund this? That is possible. We're going to get a little bit into the weeds when I talk about this, but you can overfund it to some degree. There's a point at which if you put more money in, you're not actually getting any tax break. You're kind of just taking from future years of contributions. So you may not really benefit if you go over the top with it. But the reason people do that or might want to do that is because maybe they don't think that they're going to have that high an income 5 years from now. So that there is kind of that thought process of maybe it'll make my future retirement contributions easier, which could make sense for someone who thinks they're going to either have less income or just they're going to have higher costs.
Yeah.
At some point, like living costs in the future.
Yeah. So what you're getting at here is that there's like a bunch of variables to knowing what you can put in, right? So one of them is, what was put in prior years. Another one is growth of the investments, and another one is age, right? So like if this calendar year I wanted to, put in, let's say I could put in $100,000 and I go invest that, and I invested in Bitcoin and Bitcoin doubles. That's actually not very advantageous inside of this plan because the following year, you're barely going to get to put any in, right? And so that's like part of what you're getting at, right? Is if you over contribute in this year, that's going to reduce what you can do the next year because it's targeting some defined benefit. And so too much growth means that in future years you can put less in, right? Or vice versa, right? If you choose to say, hey, I'm going to invest this in something that's getting, no return, that might actually allow you to put more in the next year. But one thing that I see, I have a client in this situation and they came in and it's in like 8 individual stocks. They thought the benefit of this was, hey, like if I'm paying somebody else to have to run this plan, they better be investing this for growth or I'm leaving stuff on the table. And the interesting thing is in the beginning, too much growth, reduces the tax deferral, right? And if you can get 30,000 less in and you're in the 50% tax bracket, right, that's got to grow by a lot to be better than the deduction. But on the flip side, if you have $1 million in your cash balance plan right now, because you've been doing it for so long, now it's the opportunity cost, right? Do I invest really conservatively to get extra in, or because the balance is so big, is growth better? And, sometimes these kind of decisions become hard.
100%. And also these things can go wrong if you take too much or too little risk, right? To your point, it's sort of, if you take too little risk and your returns are way too low, then you're probably going to wind up kind of being forced to do catch-up contributions in future years, whether your cash flow can support it or not. It's a risk some folks are willing to take, but for the most part, we try to avoid that. Same thing if you're trying to go way too high growth. In this account, it is ironically a downside, just like you said, because you won't be able to contribute in the future, and that tax benefit you could have gotten might be more or higher than the growth in the first place, or the same. So we do try to actually, when we're managing these things, we try to keep the portfolios pretty universally like within a pretty tight band of, a moderate portfolio shooting for a relatively reasonable rate of return and keeping risk relatively low.
Let's play out a hypothetical scenario, because I think we all agree that we have an understanding of who this is good for, right? Ben, I think as simple as you said it, like a business owner making a lot of money wants to pay less in taxes, this should at least be explored. I think the second thing is there needs to be a lot of excess cash flow, right? Because I think, in my stance on this is like tax deferred retirement accounts can be great, but also building up a taxable account can be great too. So there needs to be really a huge delta between how much you're making, how much you're spending, and what you have left over to save. If you're a business owner and you're listening to this and you're saying like, man, this certainly sounds like me, but I don't know if this is going to sound like me in 5 or 6 or 7 years because of XYZ circumstance. What kind of advice and how are you walking them through that decision, Ben, in terms of, hey, does this make sense for me to really explore this, or should I just table this and maybe I max out my 401k and I just keep adding to my taxable bucket?
See, that's a really good question, because I think you're right, Jacob. You need to have this as a pretty balanced portion of your overall net worth, right? If you're just socking everything away for long-term retirement and you have nothing in your taxable, assets or your taxable accounts, you're probably going to regret it at some point, right? You will have wished you had a bit more you could access easily. The short answer to your question is just walking people through the potential scenarios that could happen, right? Obviously, we've talked mostly about like, all right, here's sort of what these things are. The best plan for them is to put X amount in per year, get these great, various tax advantages out of it. And at some point in the future, it'll grow up to be a pretty significant part of your long-term net worth. But that's it. It's really for long-term net worth. What could happen in the short term is a whole bunch of things. So for example, I work with a bunch of people in the entertainment space, especially like content creators, pro gamers, that kind of fun stuff, similar to athletes. To some degree they do, and to some degree they don't control their own career path. They don't necessarily know when it's all going to end out of nowhere, or when they might need a break or come back, all that kind of stuff. And so one of the things that I would talk through for that crowd is basically, all right, if we say we're going to start this year and we're going to have pretty high confidence we can at least contribute to it for 3, 4, 5 years, but after that contracts run out, we don't know what's going to happen next. Here are the levers that can be pulled. One, you don't have as much flexibility if you want to keep these accounts going. So we can start to prioritize the, $60, $70, $80 to $100,000 contribution to this account, if you can still support it. And maybe we kind of pare back on what we're putting into a 401k. 401k, right, is super discretionary. You don't have to contribute the maximum every single year. With this account, if you want to keep it going, you kind of need to stick within a certain band, depending on these other variables we talked about, depending on the returns. So that's one lever to pull. You can kind of decide to deprioritize the 401k and increase just focus on what you're doing in the DB plans. The other thing you could do is try to figure out, well, when could it make sense to dissolve the plan? Do I have any risks with just dissolving it? And if it's reasonable enough where it says, okay, well, we've been doing this for 3, 4, 5 years, and now this person's career unfortunately is over, or the business is sold, and we need to stop the plan. There's plenty of people who have done that successfully. It's not the end of the world at all. And so then it's a matter of saying, okay, well, do you still have what you want to have outside of this plan? Is that all okay? And then what do you do with this at that point in time? And there's plenty of things to do with that, right? These are all pre-tax accounts. Any defined benefit plan, generally speaking, is a pre-tax account. So it can be, consolidated with other pre-tax accounts. This can be rolled into an IRA, can be rolled into a 401k.
Which is typically what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Most situations when we're setting clients up for this, it's right. Hey, we have a certain number of years where we want to defer to get to a point where we roll this to an IRA and then we convert, right? Because, for the average client that I'm doing this with, they're in the 37% bracket and they're in some high state tax state. There are some that aren't, but in general, they're in the 43 to 50+% marginal bracket, right? And so the deferral's all coming in that bracket. But then in the future, you have an issue, right? How do we get this money out and lower your effective tax rate? And so you think, okay, well, post business sales, some things like that could work, but you do need to understand how wealthy you are, because if you have such a large taxable portfolio, if you have tons of income coming in, you might not have much room, but the vast majority of people will, right? Even if you have a portfolio that's spitting off a few $100,000 of income, you still have some in 24, you have some in 32, you have some in 35, maybe an average rate of 30, which is way better than, in the 40s to, low 50%. So like, this isn't something that you just do without a strategy of how you're going to end up lowering your lifetime effective tax bill. I do think the other issue is, right, like you don't want to defer, and then have no money available for the goals that you have. So all of this really does come down to planning, which is why I like either big contributions to a taxable account. I guess the other side is like, hey, if you're going to sell your business in like 5 years and that's all going to be taxable dollars, maybe it's okay to be fine not putting a ton into there. I mean, What do you think we're missing so far on this?
Well, I'll quickly jump in here. The only other thing we haven't talked about, which is a reason potentially not to do this,
Yeah.
is if you're starting out and you're self-employed and you don't really, this is just you, but you plan to have a whole bunch of employees over time. If you're trying to scale and you want a bunch of employees, this could become a massive cost center, huge.
Yeah.
Because you have to, cover employees who you would have to cover for a 401k, for example. And so if you wind up in a position where the contributions that your business has to make to the employees outweighs what you're getting in benefits out of this, you're going to wish you never started this in the first place. So there's a few other scenarios like that we don't see terribly often, but certainly just the whole cost side of things are worth, being aware of and understanding as you look at the other elements beyond the kind of tax level, retirement level planning benefits you're going to get.
I think this is an important thing to harp on too. If you're getting this advice from an advisor, I think one question I would ask is like, how often do you do this for your clients? And can I talk to somebody else that you've implemented this for? Because there are a lot of moving pieces with this. And Ben, we were just talking before the show about TPAs, and that's a whole other discussion that we haven't even talked about. But we had a client situation come up where the advisor recommended this, and the advisor, for whatever reason, didn't realize that they had another business that had a bunch of employees. So this has become essentially a huge cost center if they're going to keep it. And the client's saying, well, man, I really wanted to do it. Like the benefits sounded so great. But now those benefits are completely washed away by additional costs that would come with them keeping this policy. And that's where I just think with any of these things that we talk about, like tax strategies, like they can all be great, but they have to be great for the right person. And the only other thing that I would add too is we've talked a little bit about this concept of like taxable accounts and tax deferred accounts. If you are a high net worth business owner and you're on your way to maybe ultra high net worth, $20+ million, I would be really cognizant too of like, what is your lifetime effective tax rate? Thomas, you mentioned this, but like this idea that we really need to be planning around like, when are we planning on spending this money? And I think that's a concept that I think more people need to think about. As you're saving money and choosing what accounts to save it into, thinking about earmarking like, okay, if I was going to save money into this account, when would I be spending it in the future? And that's where I think good planning comes into play. Like we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but more often than not, you probably haven't thought about that. And having a really good advisor in your team to help you better understand, like, here's what we're seeing in the future. Here's kind of how we're projecting it. Are you seeing it that way, or do you see something different?
It's a really good point. Jacob, because the other part of this is obviously, this is designed to help meet goals, and it's just one tool in the tool shed. Now, we've kind of hinted at this a bunch of times, but the most important question is, where does this fit into someone's overall financial picture and someone's financial life? And I think to your point, like there's a whole bunch of scenarios where this makes tons of sense. It's sort of easy to say, like, you own a business, you got high income, you got good cash flow, think about this. And there's a whole bunch more scenarios where it's kind of like, all right, well, here's where it does make sense. Here's where it really makes sense. And here's where you need to be very aware that like there could be problems. The other one that's come up in the past for our clients is, and Thomas, we may have spoken about this too recently, when we're talking about this with one person, and let's say that it's, the wife and a couple, and then her spouse also owns a business. Well, if the two spouses both own a business and they create any kind of qualified plan, you need to be aware that, right, an advisor needs to be aware that like that creates what's called a control group. And if one spouse has employees and the other one doesn't, there could be some like pretty surprising costs, because the defined benefit plan created by one spouse has to cover all businesses and all employees in the control group. So they may have to actually give retirement benefits to their spouse's employees. Those kinds of things happen every so often, not all the time, but often enough where we've talked about it a few times, I think, Thomas. It sort of just comes up out of nowhere. And it can, again, get very tricky. But without getting too much into the weeds, I think there's probably more examples where it makes tons of sense. And then from my perspective, like the client's hesitation is more around, okay, how can I wrap my head around the idea that I can put a lot away? Great. I can get a lot of tax benefits. Fantastic. I can see the costs. I'm okay with those, and it makes sense and it's worth it. But how confident am I that I can commit to this? And how long does that need to last? And that's also where it's, good advisors can help with that conversation, but good TPAs can also make a pretty big difference, right? Not all TPA is third-party administrator, for those who are, kind of not familiar with the term. They're usually needed to help create the documents, do the actuarial calculations each year, and just maintain the plan's status every year. And so like having good partners in that space, in addition to kind of the investment folks you work with and the custodians, makes a pretty big difference. And like sometimes they cost a lot, sometimes they cost very little. But just having people with good experience, like you mentioned earlier, Jacob, is massively important. Massive.
I think the other thing I want to hit on here too is that like if the name of the game for you is all deferral, then this can be a really good strategy, but you can be in the situation where that isn't and it still makes sense, right? Nobody is saying that you have to do a pre-tax solo 401k or something in this situation too. If your goal was invest and you want some deferral, but you also want Roth money, like there are situations where you could still choose to put $69,000 in via Roth between Roth, Mega Backdoor, and then still get the tax deferral to get kind of a blend of the two. And maybe that's a good situation for somebody who's a little bit younger on. They kind of get the benefit of both. But I feel like a lot of times when people think about finances, they think there's like one goal, right? And the one goal might not only be deferral, but there also might be like one client that I'm about to basically have do this. I mean, she's like 70,000 a month in surplus and she's in her early 30s. So it's super easy to be able to do this and know in the future years that you're going to be just fine because she has it's not a very sellable business. It's a very high profit business. Doing a 3-year plan of this, like she's going from no retirement account to solo 401k, cash balance plan, et cetera. And she's going to end up saving like almost 100,000 in taxes just in this first calendar year, compounded for a few years, because it's a perfect fit for her situation. But then you might have another person. It's like, that's every dollar of surplus to fund this. And what if the market, what if we're kind of in a recession, their business goes down and they don't have the dollars to fund it? Like, if it's going to be close and it's going to add stress, it's probably not the right thing to do.
Yeah, big time. I'll give you guys one last little quick story here, but some of this has also evolved a lot over the last 15, 20 years, right? Like we're talking about defined benefit plans for people today. It used to be like the single largest source of retirement savings for everybody in America, right? It was the idea like 50s, 60s and onwards was sort of like, all right, you work for one company, you get that pension, that corporate pension plan, or you work for the government, get their pension plan, and you're set for life. And the reason like that doesn't exist anymore, I mean, it still exists, but much, much smaller. Very few people in this country are going to have access to those kinds of pensions going forward. The reason is because, the way they were designed and managed over several economic cycles was relatively flawed. Right. The problem from 2008, for example, was a bunch of these pensions had the expectation, the assumed return rate was 8% per year. And sometimes it was 9%, sometimes it was 7%, but 8% per year was their assumed rate of return. And when you have a year like 08 where things were down, 55% peak to trough, that's not easy to accomplish. And so you had a whole bunch of corporations get rid of their pension plans. You had entire towns have to declare bankruptcy with these things or have to completely redo their finances. And now those are pretty extreme examples. And I'm bringing this up because what we're talking about is not those things at all. And if you were to create one like this, you would want to make sure you set it up in a way that was much more realistic. Bottom line, don't use 8 or 9% as an assumed rate of return, right? 5, 6 might make sense. If it's too low, it might be a little unrealistic and you might easily outpace it. So you don't want to be too low. You don't want to be too high. But you also kind of, also need to understand that the liability, if you have employees or, a bunch of participants, is there. It's an important fiduciary liability that an employer might have to the plan. If it's just, you or a person is a single business owner with no employees, they're certainly going to have a much more, confident time or a much more, an easier set of flexible rules to kind of stick within to make sure that this can be maintained successfully. And so this is something that's really evolved a lot over the years. It's also why cash balance is becoming a lot more popular because of that flexibility and just the ease of management. So there's certainly more we could kind of get into in the history of things. But I think, if I were to kind of tie that thought up into, one sentence, it's sort of like, if this can be something that's good for you, talk to an advisor about it, find the right partners and have that advisor find the right partners and make sure that you go in eyes wide open, ready to say, all right, here's what I'm gonna get out of this. Here's what I plan to do with this. And I understand the scenarios of like what might happen if things deviate a little bit.
Yeah, you're not fully DIYing this. It's actually not possible. You need an actuary to be a part of this. So like, don't even think it is. And I wouldn't even risk doing that even if you could. But I think kind of as a recap, right? Cash balance plans are this incredible tool to allow you to defer a lot of dollars, right? This is perfect for high income, high profit people who, even if they're either going to be here for a long time or, hey, I know I have, 3, 5, 10 years of this really high income earning potential. This is a very rare tax bracket for me to be in. I want to defer every dollar I possibly can for other times in my life where I can convert it or even just like do all Roth in the other periods of time where you're going to be in a lower bracket. But super great tool. It's stacked on top of a solo 401k most times, or a 401k if there's employees. You have this kind of hurdle rate that you need to aim to be towards. Anything below allows higher contributions. Anything above reduces future contributions. But understand, like, you're kind of stuck in this for the X years of a time. So you need to plan well. Might even be a big reason to have more liquidity during this period of time. Like, maybe you don't invest every dollar. Maybe you hold a little bit higher cash either in the business or personal to make this work. And at the end of the day, you need an actuary, you need a TPA, you need to really think, how is this the best part of my plan? Not just, oh, I'd love to defer, I do this, and then years down the line, it ends up being the wrong decision. But I think that's all that we really wanted to go over today, Ben. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge as always. Everybody, if you're in a complex situation, ultra high net worth, hit me up. Ben and I work together on a lot of client cases. If you're an athlete, Jacob's your guy. I mean, especially if you're playing baseball. But everybody, again, we really appreciate you listening and following along with this podcast. We really love doing it. We love having people like Ben on. So just help us keep doing this. Give us a review. Follow us. We play the video on YouTube. And if you have any ideas, send it to us. But we'll see you next week.